Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help you manage the thoughts and the feelings related to your loss. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Grief Refuge is about helping you find peace and purpose after loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate your grief-related thoughts and feelings. Take time to reflect and to honor your self-care. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You can also find comfort, hopefulness, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss and life moving forward. Through the stories and the conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to provide companionship, insight, and also a soothing voice to help you navigate the heavier, more painful feelings that go hand in hand with grief. Grief is hard and grief is painful. I'm glad you're here with me, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, let's go over a little housekeeping. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your personal self-care and reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month. When you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode. Things can come up, and you may feel setbacks, confusion, get overwhelmed, and other things may happen that cause more pain. If you're in need of more support, download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app is a hub for getting more support. On the Grief Refuge app, you can find stories, tips, and guidance for navigating your grief journey. You can also receive daily messages of validation, hope, and comfort to help soothe and comfort you throughout this difficult journey. You can download the Grief Refuge app for free from your phone's app store. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Call it an irony or even a paradox, but grief has the power to pull you into more unknowns and make you feel utterly uncomfortable. Too much change is scary, and these transitions can feel painful. Today, I'm sharing an interview with my friend and colleague Jan Owen. Jan is a licensed therapist in Alabama, and she's the author of the book Fighting Forward. Jan shares more of her personal story and how she navigates her own grief. Plus, she provides helpful guidance for anyone grieving and struggling with the fear of the unknown. Healing is hard work. When loss, grief, and trauma are the culprits, it's hard to believe that everything will work out. Hopefully, this interview and conversation with Jan will help shine some light on your pain. Hey, Jan, welcome to Grief Refuge. It's such an honor that you're here. I appreciate you making the time. I'm really excited to learn more about your profession, also share more about your personal story. I'm going to share the little bias in our introduction that you and I had the opportunity to recently meet in person in Arizona. We were at a special training to develop our skills in the work that we do. And I got the opportunity to hear you share pieces of your story. And I just thought, Jan has a very powerful experience. I think that many can value and benefit from hearing it. And so I'm glad that this all came together, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation today, Jan.
Well, thank you for having me, Reed. I feel very honored to be a part of this conversation.
We're honored you're here. I want to start with your work. Please, if you will, please tell us a little bit about what you do in this space for grief support.
Well, I'm a therapist, a mental health therapist, and my specialty is in grief and trauma. I do see other types of clients, but I guess my specialty is in this area of loss, which so often is accompanied by some type of trauma. And so I have a private practice in Huntsville, Alabama, and see clients from all over the state via telehealth and in person, and am often referred to just for that specialty. You know, people know that I've had a loss, that I am especially trained in grief. And so, and that's what I do day to day. So,
And how long have you been doing this type of work?
only 2 years in March, so not even 2 years yet. I graduated in December of 2019 and received my license the week before COVID hit.
What a journey.
Yes. Yes, that was quite interesting to have an office that I didn't need. I was paying rent on it, but it has uh, it has felt in some ways sort of providential. If that sounds, I don't mean that to sound like it's about me or whatever, but like the world is really in need of skilled and empathic healers right now, and so it feels sort of like I'd graduated into a storm, but also at a time when there's an extra need as well.
Hmm. Often people feel called to do this type of work, specifically in grief. I'll own up to that as part of my own story. How did you find this work, or how did the work find you?
Mm. Well, I spent most of my adult life in ministry. I'm an ordained minister. And I spent many, many years working with students and worship ministry, kind of an associate pastor role at times. And so I've always felt, I guess, a calling towards people. And in 2014, when my husband passed away, I had been doing nonprofit work at that point as a minister when I wasn't being paid anything. So he got sick and died. And that was, obviously horrible and so much grief with that. But the sort of practical piece that is difficult to talk about at times is I didn't have a job. And in the South, ministry positions for women are not really very stable, or it just kind of depends on the pastor who you might get hired. This denomination may not hire women. And also, I just felt led in a different direction, but I wasn't sure what that direction was. And so I spent a great deal of time doing my own grief work. I volunteered in some Facebook groups for a while, just doing some administration work with widows and widowers, some Facebook groups that I became a part of. I, for a while, led a sort of a project at Christmas called Widow to Widow that grew more than I could handle on my own, which was to send a Christmas box to anyone that it was experiencing their first Christmas after the loss of a spouse or a partner. And so I think I was feeling this sort of innate need to maybe help people whose pain I now better understood, for lack of a better term. But I still didn't know what was next for my life. And I had this horrible fear that I would end up, I don't know, working at the gas station down the street. I didn't know what would happen. I had always been recruited before. So I didn't have any experience in looking, and I didn't even have a degree. I was finishing my bachelor's. So I had not even finished a bachelor's degree. And so I just didn't really know what would come next, right? This transition period for me was very painful. And I kept praying, what should I do next? I kept feeling this sort of compulsion to go to grad school, which this sounds backwards. Like, why would you feel a compulsion to go to grad school without even knowing what degree you are going for? But in that time, I also wrote my book and just sort of naturally people started gravitating because I spoke openly about my grief. I think that's a piece of it. I spoke very openly about my grief. And so people would message me, and I was no expert, but I was willing to talk and I was willing to try to help. During that time, I discovered Dr. Wolfeld's trainings where you and I met, and also began to have a glimmer of this idea of, I don't know, some place of refuge. I don't know. It was very vague. I was still grieving acutely, and just, it was a pulling, for lack of a better term, just like a pulling. So I had this desire to open a retreat cabin, a place for respite, but really gave no thought to being a therapist per se. But I did need to make a living as well. Um, and things kind of aligned. The more I prayed, the more I felt drawn to something in grief and bereavement. I don't know why it didn't occur to me at first to be a counselor, but it didn't. And I was actually on a phone call with a young career counselor at the University of Alabama doing a project just for my undergrad work. And he said, well, I don't talk to many people your age. What are your plans after you get your degree? And so I don't know why I shared with a perfect stranger this crazy vision of a cabin in the woods for respite. And he said, you do know you want to become a counselor, don't you? And now I didn't know this, but I know now because I've met him. He was 24. So he was a young man. And he said, I'm going to send you some things. And he sent me like the coursework because I had already been praying about grad school, but I was looking at like a master's of fine arts in writing or something very impractical. And he sent me this coursework list, and I opened it, and it was like a bolt of lightning. I don't know how else to describe it. I just knew that was where I was supposed to be. And so it kind of clicked together, for lack of, like these different thoughts and ideas and this vision and this real, very much desire to be a healer and a helper and to work with people that were hurting. It just all sort of came together. And also my need to make a living. It came together in that moment for me. And that was sort of the key moment for me, I guess. I worried about leaving my vocation, is how it felt to me after many years in ministry. I had people even say that, are you leaving your calling? But I feel like grief work is such, well, any healing work is such sacred work. I've worked with Muslims, Jews, atheists, every denomination you can think of. And there's something very sacred about life and death and healing and our most tender pain. So I don't think I've left my calling.
I think thank you. Everything you said has just been beautiful. It almost leaves me at a loss for words, but we can't do that on a podcast. I just want to sit here and hold space for a lot of the sacredness that I think that you've voiced right now. But I do want to ask a question or two.
Sure.
The young gentleman that took the phone call or made those recommendations about becoming a counselor, do you ever think of that young gentleman as like a guide?
I do actually. I have had several people that I feel like that were guides that just felt very out of the blue, moments that felt very clarifying. But yes, it felt very, again, I'll use the word almost providential. Like, what are the odds, right, of just randomly getting some guy that's probably on a work study program or getting hours in his master's program? um, he actually just graduated with his doctorate in counseling. So, but yes, it felt like he spoke something at a time I needed, you know? And sometimes other people can see things we don't because I was immersed in, oh my gosh, I just have to figure this out. And I'm scared I'm not going to be able to. I'm fearful. I'll work at Walmart which is genuine work, but it was not what I was feeling called to. I didn't know how to get to what I was feeling. It was like somebody put like a stepping stone down or shown a flashlight or something. So yes, I've thanked him in person. So
The reason why I ask is because I think about your work, and you articulated the aspects of healing and doing sacred work. And I was curious if you ever perceive yourself as a guide to other people's healing.
I hope I shine a light. I hope I give hope in a time when it can be difficult to hope, right? Especially in early grief when people have been very traumatized often. I, yeah, I hope that there's a light there. I do think my work is healing work. I think it's more difficult for me to personalize that. Although I don't have a problem saying that other people are a light and are healers, if that makes sense. I think it feels like a lot to say about yourself, but
I
it is
do.
what I hope, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know if it's humbleness, humility, whatever, but kind of, throwing ourselves into the box of caregivers. In
Yeah.
my own experience, I'll give everybody else credit before I give myself any credit, and it's never really spent too much time delving in it because I've been focused on helping and showing up for people who need the support.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's something to ponder for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You also said in some of your sharing that at the time of your loss, you just didn't know what would happen, and you spoke to a lot of the fear of the unknown. And I imagine that people come into work with you, and although it's integrated into their own lives, they are experiencing a lot of the fear of the unknowns. And so I'm curious, not necessarily do you have any tools, Jan, but I'm very curious about, like, do you recognize thematically perhaps how you show up to help them either face or work through the fears that they're currently dealing with?
Well, you know, when people come in it to begin with, they are probably just dealing with sort of the separation from the person they loved, right? Like the physical loss. And that can often, though, there can be a lot of anxiety around that. So anxiety is very common in grief, and it's not even always seemingly related to the loss. Like just people just are more anxious over a lot of things that don't, not necessarily don't feel directly linked. So I'm not sure at the beginning people know. They haven't gotten to that part of the journey. Almost, it's like at the beginning you're just devastated, that you've lost this person. And then as they begin to go through the grief process, these other questions come up of like, well, what now? And usually why, and then what now, and how can I, at first I don't want to live without them. Sometimes, that's an often thing I hear. I don't talk to me about the future because I don't care about the future really. But then eventually, as people move through some of their grief and allow themselves to have moments of joy, maybe again down the road, then we see this, you know, what seemed impossible is now maybe possible, right? Could be on the horizon. And so I guess my goal for people, if I had one, is that they could find meaning and purpose again and believe that life can be good again. And they would desire to live. You know, they don't have that early grief. I just don't even care if I live or die, that they would be able to walk into the unknown. And so I think the biggest thing I talk to people about is, you know, like we take it gently, you know, we go a little bit by little bit, right? Like you don't have to figure out um, the end game, if we could even know that. But all change is frightening. And so, you know, I try to talk to them about the thing in front of you, you know, like this moment. And then um okay, now that this question or this, you know, we have addressed that, then just recognizing that we can't live into what will the fullness of what will be in a new life, that takes, I mean, there's a reason it's called a journey, is because it takes multiple steps, right? So you can't jump ahead because you wouldn't be ready. And so we talk a lot about living with this uncertainty, but also trusting that life can be good again. So I do, it's a lot of holding of conflicting emotions at the same time. You know, I'm afraid. Um, I do believe life can be good again. You know, it's a real, you know, this from your own experience, that there's a real, even emotions that feel very opposite, right? And so almost teaching them to hold that that's not abnormal, that's very normal, normalizing that. And it's just very step by step, very slow and gentle work. And then we try to celebrate the victories, right? You know, when they're afraid of things, we try to celebrate, you know, things that were hard, that don't seem hard to other people. Maybe they weren't hard before their person died. Maybe they feel ridiculous that they're hard now. But we celebrate those things, and hopefully that helps people gain confidence. So, but it feels like you have to like live into these things, right? Like it's not, I'm terrible with quotes, but I believe it is, and I'll say this wrong, Rainier Maria Rilke, that said, you know, you should love the questions because but you have to live into them. I'm very much paraphrasing. So there has to be, you know, not be this, try not to fear. Life is full of unknowns, but just sort of see as you live, you know, what direction does that take you, you know? Instead, people have this blank slate and they're alone, and they feel like they're supposed to have like the whole slate filled up, you know, and there's no way to do that to begin with. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Definitely answers it enough. I
Mhm.
think I agree with you. Yes, a lot of people want the script, the playbook, or the menu to look at so that they can choose, you know, what works for them as
Right.
far as healing from grief. But
Mhm.
I like your metaphor for it is a blank slate. It kind of
Mhm.
needs to be created. You know, Jen, speaking of blank slates, it sounds like writing was a deep part of your healing process, for lack of a better term.
Mhm.
How did writing play a part through your grief and coming to where you are now?
Well, I am an external processor, and I've always journaled and written in the past, even through other difficult experiences. I've wrote a lot, even when I was in ministry, enjoyed sort of processing like that. So at first, I just wrote sort of for my own sanity, you know, like let's say something came up for me, like going through my husband's clothes, and I would have this feeling like I feel like I'm erasing him by getting rid of his clothes. Well, I even kept a list of topics on my computer because I had so many things in my head and I couldn't just sit and write all day. So I would just keep a list and I would come back to it and I would just journal about that thing. And frankly, I look back and I sort of still, I read and I think, oh, did I say that? It almost surprised me, but yet it helped me say things that I don't know that I had any other place to say. I had a counselor. She was not a grief counselor. She was wonderful. I just went in and threw up emotionally every week, but she was not, she'd never been widowed. Grief was not her specialty. She was wonderful, supportive. But even with her, I think there were things I was afraid to say because I did not have any normalization. I didn't know anything about the grieving process. I didn't know other people felt foggy. I didn't know any of that. I didn't know what was normal, what was not. And so I think I just didn't have anywhere else to put it, right? So I just would just write. And I even did a 30-day writing course called Write Your Grief, which I believe is offered through Megan Devine's Understanding Your Grief. Is that what I think? No, Refuge in Grief. I'm sorry.
My cousin.
Is that your cousin? Your
No,
kid?
but
Oh, the name. Sorry.
full disclosure, here on the Grief Refuge podcast, when I started Grief Refuge, I did not know Megan Devine's Refuge in Grief existed. And there have been a lot of people who have contacted me and said, I'd like some additional help. I read your book. Well, I haven't published a book. So I pretty much know for certain that they come from refuge, or they find something
Yes,
related to Megan Devine's
great.
work.
Yeah, she wrote "It's Okay to Not Be Okay," and she has a great grief journal, interactive grief journal that I love. Where was I going with that?
The writing course.
Oh yeah, so she did like this 30-day writing course, and you got like a prompt and an email every day, and then you could share in a Facebook group some or part of what you wrote if you wanted to. And I don't know that I did all of them. I couldn't tell you which ones were from her, which ones were my own internal deliberations, but I just wrote. I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I was finishing my undergrad degree at the time. Speaking of guides, this was another moment. This elderly professor who I never met in person, it was a distance class, and she read, it was a women's studies class. And in an email about an assignment, I don't know what I mentioned about, and she said, I would love to read some of what you've written because I feel like widowed women are it's like an invisible piece of population, which she's right about. And so I just sent a few little things. She was a professor emeritus. I didn't know this at the time, former head of women's studies at the University of Alabama. And she read it and she was like, oh, can I read this like at my church? I mean, we're going to do some like education. And she was the one that said, why don't you write a book and do it for your senior project? And I said, oh, but it's not like academic. It's not like research based. And she was like, oh, throw a few statistics in and we'll beg forgiveness instead of asking permission. And so she was one of those that sort of said, I think there's something to offer in your experience and encourage that. I was writing just for my own sanity. I would occasionally share something in a widows group or a piece on Facebook, but really mainly it just gave a voice for all that was within me. I have things I wrote that I've never published, of course, but the journaling piece, unedited, just kept me. I felt like I wrote my way back to sanity. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that that professor, nudged you. There is, I still haven't nailed it yet, but I can still sense it. There's still something just very compelling about your experience and where you are in the present time and how you show up for others, and even your background in ministry. Something all tying it in. I think there's just, perhaps there'll be another book. I don't know. But let's transition into a little bit of the future for
Okay.
what you intend to do. You've alluded to it. You had a vision, have a vision for a place of refuge, and that's really intriguing to me because another full disclosure here on Grief Refuge, when I started the idea for the concept of Grief Refuge, it was all about providing retreats.
Mhm.
Well, the pandemic happened. So somehow, I don't know if it's the universe or if it's just the way my mind works, but I leaned on a lot of technology skills and opened up podcasting and the app into the digital space. I've greatly enjoyed it. And I still feel, we'll call it a desire, a strong desire to be in retreat like experiences with people who are looking for space for healing. So I'm so intrigued, Jan, by your concept of the place of refuge you'd like to create. Tell us whatever you want about this vision for this idea.
So it originated as this. I live in the woods on the side of a mountain with a winter view of the Tennessee River. That means when the leaves are gone, I can see the river in the distance. I live a mile from where I grew up. Um, Very beautiful, very natural, very peaceful. And I have 2 acres where I live. And I think I just originally envisioned this little tiny house thing. People could come rest. Honestly, I think I envisioned what I wanted for myself, which was just a place to escape and feel cared for, to rest, but also with some attention, to the pain that I felt was not always acknowledged by others in my world. And even though they loved me, grief is tiring and it does require special attention. So I think I had this vague idea, like this little cabin in the woods, no further thought really. That, went on to become a therapist, working towards licensure, middle of a pandemic, really set that aside, thinking maybe that was just some theoretic thing. I don't know when that would happen, whatever. Well, I was going to my car one morning and looked in the woods across my driveway and thought, like, why have I not just tried to buy the land right beside me? And like, it's right there. I don't know why it's steep and it's wooded, but it just had never occurred to me. And so I don't totally know my vision. I sort of lean towards more individual stuff, like maybe a 1 or 2 bedroom cabin where a couple or an individual could come, and if they wanted to, we could do some grief therapy, or if they don't, we could just do some quiet time. But I love the idea also of like a very small group grief retreat, 4 or 5 people, because I understand the value of group too and of company on the journey. So I don't totally have that fleshed out yet. We're, just now kind of getting around to loans and, all the legal stuff. So that's still on the horizon. I don't totally have an answer for you. My general vision is a place of healing and rest. And because I'm a therapist, I would love to be able to offer not just psychoeducation and peer support, but maybe some deeper work. I do EMDR if people have trauma. I love that idea. But I want it more than anything to be a place where people can feel cared for and seen. I think nature is healing and grounding, and I live in a beautiful place. So that's not like a huge um, amount of details yet, but that's my heart. I have ideas about, carving out some walking trails and maybe a little natural, like prayer chapel, not like building anything, but like a space that's like in the, um, I don't have it all fleshed out, but I'm very excited about something that's dedicated to healing, something that's dedicated to giving people an opportunity to pay attention to that inner journey of grief that so often the world feels like it wants us to hurry up and push past. It needs space and time.
You know what? A couple of things come to mind, Jan. One, although you say that the details may not be there, they kind of sound like they're for me. So trust the process.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, although that you're still formulating details, it sounds like your intentions are pure. You know, you've been naming that. And I've been noticing as you've been describing and sharing what you've voiced, I'm like, I feel a sense of peace. And so it, for me, it's really exciting to know that something will unfold. Something's going to manifest, and it's likely going to be a beautiful experience to all who participate. The third thing that comes to mind, Jan, is as you've described early in our conversation about taking things kind of moment by moment and working through grief, I feel like there's a special metaphor or a special analogy towards how this vision for your place of refuge in this, whatever we're going to call it, grief retreat or not, something else. I like how you're giving yourself permission to take it moment by moment to see, you know, what gets revealed to you in relationship to, you know, what you desire. It's a beautiful analogy for how to approach life and how to approach grief.
I think we have to grow into these things sometimes too. We have to sort of like, I don't know, like maybe there's something within my own journey and growth and healing that I haven't learned or is not, that's a piece of what will come, right? That's not quite there yet. My youngest child lives in California, and when I texted her and told her we were going to buy the property next door, she was like, "Oh, what are you going to name it?" And I'm like, first steps first. We have to get a loan. So like just one thing at a time, right? We have to do, the survey, all these things, like just one thing at a time. I don't love to operate like that. Most people, I love certainty. I would love this big drawn out plan from day one, but I just have sort of learned that I could make a plan. It would probably have to change. And so I think there's just a living into it that I'm still doing that will still allow me to maybe offer something greater or more meaningful as I continue to grow and do my own work. So I'm trying not to get ahead of myself.
I definitely respect it. I think that's brilliant. Well, Jan, I think we could converse for a lot longer. I love the sense of peace I feel when talking to you. And I trust that everybody listening to this conversation feels something similar in their own experience. Thank you so much for being a part of Grief Refuge. It's been such a joy to have you.
Oh, I've enjoyed it so much, Reed. Thank you for inviting me. As you might imagine, not many people in my everyday life ask these kind of questions or invite me to even reflect on my journey. And I certainly don't really do that in this way, of course, with clients. And so it's really an honor to be able to share and just to have time to talk about something that's important to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and our mission. We help the grieving find peace and purpose after loss. All of what you're experiencing is important work, and although painful at times, it's necessary for helping heal your heart, mind, and soul. You can get more stories, guidance, insights, and more grief support on the Grief Refuge app, which I hope you download from your phone's app store now. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.